All right, let's dive deep into the life of James Madison.
James Madison.
You know, the guy everyone calls the father of the Constitution. But trust me, his story is a lot more interesting than just, dusty old parchment.
Yeah. There's this real paradox with Madison, right? Like he's this champion of liberty, but he also, lived in a world built on slavery. So it's a really challenging legacy to understand.
Yeah, and you see that right from the start.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, born in 1751, this wealthy Virginia plantation family, eldest of 12 kids, you can just imagine the privilege. But he also ended up being the shortest president.
Oh, really?
Yeah, 5'4".
Wow.
So I always wonder, how did he command a room, right? Did he have to, overcompensate? Did he have to work harder to be taken seriously?
It's an interesting thought. I mean, we can only speculate, but what we do know is that he was incredibly intelligent. He went to Princeton, back then it's called the College of New Jersey. And despite dealing with a lot of illnesses, he really excelled.
Yeah, and that education, it must really shaped his worldview, but it also gave him, the skills to be a leader.
Definitely.
And he puts those skills to use pretty quickly, right? Gets elected to the Virginia legislature at just 25. Talk about an early start.
Yeah.
And it's during this time that his friendship with Thomas Jefferson really blossoms, and they end up collaborating on this really important document, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which feels especially relevant these days, don't you think?
Absolutely. It was incredibly important for laying the groundwork for the separation of church and state. Yeah. It's something we often take for granted today, but they fought really hard for the right to practice your faith without the government interfering.
Yeah, so we have this young, brilliant politician in a newly independent nation trying to figure out its identity. The revolution's over, but the Articles of Confederation, their first attempt at a government, it's just not working, is it?
No, not at all. It was too weak. There was too much infighting, just wasn't effective.
And this is where Madison really steps up, right?
He does.
He sees this nation falling apart and realizes they need something better, something stronger. And so he comes up with the Virginia Plan.
Yeah, his big idea.
Which is this, well, it's kind of revolutionary.
Yeah, totally.
It's a government with three branches, right? You have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial.
Checks and balances.
Checks and balances, right.
Exactly.
So no one branch gets too powerful.
Exactly.
Wait
a minute. Isn't that basically the system we have today?
Yeah, pretty much. Madison really laid the foundation for the U.S. Constitution. He looked at historical examples and he drew on Enlightenment philosophy. He understood that power corrupts, so he wanted to create a system where ambition, would actually check ambition.
So here's this guy, not even 40 years old, and he's already had this massive impact on history.
Yeah, it's incredible.
But he doesn't stop there. He teams up with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, and they write the Federalist Papers. What were they trying to do with those exactly? Well, think of it like a political campaign. But instead of rallies, they're using the power of the pen, right? They're writing these essays, published in newspapers all over the newly formed states, arguing for ratification of the Constitution. They were addressing people's concerns, explaining how it all worked, really just trying to sell this new form of government to the people.
So Madison's not just the architect. He's the head of marketing.
Exactly.
And even after the Constitution's ratified, he doesn't just sit back, right? He's elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and he keeps fighting for these individual rights.
Well, that's right.
And this leads to, this is another huge achievement, the Bill of Rights.
The first 10 amendments?
The first 10 amendments to the Constitution. These are the freedoms we still talk about today. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, all of that.
Yeah, all the big ones.
And Madison's right there pushing for it.
He knew how important they were, to protect people from the government overstepping its bounds.
So we've got the Constitution, we've got the Bill of Rights, and a lot of that is thanks to James Madison, this champion of individual liberty, the architect of American democracy. But, and there's always a but when it comes to historical figures.
Oh, yeah?
There's this, this shadow hanging over all of this, isn't there?
There is. A big one.
James Madison, the champion of liberty, was also a slave owner.
Yeah.
And he benefited from enslaved labor his whole life at his plantation, Montpelier.
It's a hard truth to face.
It's so hard to understand. How can someone fight so hard for freedom, for individual rights, and then turn around and participate in a system that denies those very rights to other people.
It's a huge contradiction, and it really underscores how complicated it is to understand historical figures, right? We can't just erase this part of his story. We have to wrestle with it.
Yeah, it's uncomfortable.
It is. But he makes us ask those tough questions. How could someone as smart as Madison justify something like slavery? How could a society that was founded on the idea of liberty tolerate such a system?
So I guess it's about recognizing that even brilliant people can be products of their time. They can have these conflicting views, these actions that don't match up with our values today.
Absolutely. And that's something we have to keep in mind as we continue to learn about Madison.
And speaking of complexities, didn't he have a rather remarkable wife?
Dolly Madison.
Dolly Madison. She wasn't just like a typical first lady.
No, not at all. She was a force in her own right. Married to James in 1794, she quickly became known for her charisma and her influence in Washington, D.C. She was a true political partner to James. You know, she wielded power in a world where women were largely excluded from formal politics.
It's funny you should mention her. I've heard these stories about her saving, like, a portrait of George Washington from the White House when the British burned it down in the War of 1812. Can you imagine, like, the chaos, the fire, and she's running in there to grab this painting?
That's Dolly. She knew how important that symbol was. She was quick on her feet.
So how did James Madison even end up becoming president?
Well, after serving as Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State.
Right, which probably gave him a lot of experience with international relations.
For sure. And then in 1808, he was elected president.
And his presidency, I mean, it was dominated by these tensions with Great Britain, which eventually led to the War of 1812. And that was a controversial war, wasn't it?
Very controversial. A lot of Americans opposed it. They thought it was unnecessary, that it would hurt the economy.
So now we have Madison, this legal mastermind, champion of rights, leading the nation through this divisive war. It's like his life is full of these contradictions.
It really is. And it makes you realize how complex he was as a person.
We've only just scratched the surface of James Madison. From his privileged beginnings to his role in shaping a nation, the contradictions are everywhere.
And there's so much more to uncover. But let's take a break here for now and reflect on what we've learned so far.
Welcome back. Ready for more? We've got a lot more to uncover about this paradoxical life of James Madison.
Yeah, I'm definitely ready. Especially after that last segment, we were talking about the American Colonization Society.
Yes.
And to be honest, it left me with a lot of questions.
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? Full of contradictions. This idea of sending free African Americans to Africa, it really shows how deeply ingrained racism was at the time.
Yeah, and even among people who, consider themselves to be enlightened, it's hard to grasp, right? After seeing the horrors of slavery, the idea of Black people actually being equal members of society, it was just unthinkable to so many. It was. And that's a hard truth to face, right? But the concept of racial equality, as we understand it today, it just wasn't part of the conversation back then. Some people truly believed that colonization was, the best thing for them, like a way to give them freedom and opportunity. But others saw it as a way to, get rid of a population they saw as dangerous.
So you have this nation trying to be this beacon of liberty, but the shadow of slavery and its legacy, it's just always there. And Madison's involvement with the American Colonization Society, it's another one of those things that makes you question his beliefs, doesn't it?
It does. Even if he thought he was doing the right thing, it shows how deeply ingrained these prejudices were, even in someone like him.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If even Madison, the guy who basically wrote the blueprint for American democracy, struggled with these issues, what does that say about us today? Are we still struggling with the same things?
That's a really good question, one we should all be thinking about. But for now, let's shift gears a bit. We've talked a lot about Madison's political accomplishments, his contradictions, his relationship with slavery. But what about the man himself? What was he actually like?
Yeah, I'm curious about that too. Behind all the intellectual stuff, the political maneuvering, what was his personality like?
Well, unlike some of his contemporaries, like Jefferson, who was quite charismatic,
Oh, yeah?
Madison was more known for his brains than his charm. People described him as quiet, even shy. More comfortable with books and ideas than being in the spotlight.
So not exactly the life of the party, more like the quiet guy in the corner working on his next big idea.
Yeah, exactly. But don't let that fool you. He was a master strategist. He understood people. He could read a room and figure out how to get people on his side, even people with really strong opinions. And those skills were essential in creating a new nation out of, all these different and competing interests.
It's funny, right? A shy, bookish guy leading this massive political project. It doesn't seem to add up.
It is a bit of a contradiction. But history's full of those, isn't it? And those contradictions are what make studying these figures so fascinating. We often think of historical figures as, one-dimensional. But in reality, they were just as complex as we are, full of flaws and inconsistencies.
Speaking of complexities, Madison left behind tons of writing, right? I mean, we talked about the Federalist Papers, but I imagine there's a lot more we can learn from his personal letters, his notes, all of that.
Oh, absolutely. His writings are like a gold mine for historians. His notes from the Constitutional Convention are incredibly valuable. You can actually see how the debates unfolded, how they compromised and argued their way to this document that we still hold up as, this foundational piece of American democracy.
It's like being a fly on the wall during one of the most important moments in history.
Exactly. And his personal letters, especially those with Jefferson, show this amazing dynamic between them, this friendship built on intellectual debate and shared ideals.
It reminds you that history isn't just about big events and speeches, right? It's about the little things, the conversations and relationships that shape those events.
Exactly. And those personal glimpses give us a much better understanding of Madison. We see his humor, his passions, even his weaknesses.
So we have James Madison, the brilliant legal mind, the architect of American democracy, the slave owner, the shy scholar, the political strategist. It's a lot to process.
It is. He was a man of contradictions, that's for sure.
And as we dig deeper, I just have more and more questions.
That's the great thing about history, right? It's not about easy answers or simple stories. It's about embracing the complexity, facing those contradictions, and finding meaning in the messiness of the past.
So as we head into the final part of our deep dive, what do you think is the most important thing to take away from Madison's story? What should we, the listeners, really remember about him?
That's a great question, and we'll definitely explore that more in the last part. But for now, I'll leave you with this thought. James Madison, for all his brilliance and all his flaws, was trying to build a better future. And I think that's something worth remembering.
Well, we're back for the final part of our James Madison deep dive. And man, it's been a journey.
It has.
We've seen his privilege, his accomplishments, his flaws, this constant struggle to reconcile, the contradictions of his time.
And as we wrap up, I think we have to face the toughest question. How should history remember James Madison?
Yeah, that's the question that's been stuck in my head this whole time. I mean, how do we weigh those incredible achievements against, the things we've learned about his personal life, the era he lived in? It's almost like you can't separate the man from the time.
You've hit the nail on the head there. When we judge historical figures just by today's standards, it can really distort things. We have to remember Madison's world was completely different from ours.
So, are you saying we should, give him a pass for slavery because it was accepted back then? I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that.
No, not a pass. But understanding the context is crucial. I mean, think about trying to explain something like, I don't know, social media
Yeah.
to someone from the 18th century. It would be impossible.
Yeah.
They wouldn't get it. And in the same way, ideas we take for granted now, like racial equality, they just weren't part of the mainstream thinking back then.
I get it. It doesn't excuse his actions, but it does help explain why someone like Madison, who could talk so eloquently about freedom and individual rights,
Right.
could also, hold these views we find so awful today.
Exactly. It shows that progress isn't always a straight line. It's messy, it's slow, and even the smartest people can be blind to the injustices of their time.
So, okay, we can acknowledge the context, but we don't have to avoid criticizing him.
Right. Absolutely not. Being critical is important. It's by looking at both the good and the bad that we can really learn from Madison. It makes us confront some uncomfortable truths about our history, and about human nature in general.
So, what are some of the key things we can learn from studying James Madison? What wisdom can we take away from this deep dive?
Well, one thing that stands out is the importance of compromise in a democracy. The Constitution, this document we revere, it came about through tons of compromises, people setting aside their own agendas for the good of the whole.
Yeah, especially today when everyone seems so divided, Madison's story reminds us that we can find common ground.
Exactly. We can disagree, but we still need to talk to each other, to listen. That's how a healthy democracy works.
What else can we learn from this father of the Constitution?
Well, his commitment to individual liberty, which we see in the Bill of Rights, shows us that freedom is precious, It's not something we can just assume will always be there. We have to be vigilant. We have to participate in our government and hold our leaders accountable.
So it's not enough to just have these rights written down somewhere.
Well,
We have to actively defend them,
we do.
challenge injustice,
Yeah,
and never take our freedom for granted.
exactly. That's on all of us. Madison understood that power can corrupt, even with good intentions.
Mm-hmm.
And he knew that a healthy democracy needs citizens who are informed and engaged.
Mm-hmm.
People who are willing to speak truth to power no matter what.
Wow, that's a powerful message.
It is.
And it still resonates today. So as we wrap up, I keep coming back to this question. What's the final verdict on James Madison? How should we as a society remember him?
I think we should remember him as a complex person with both strengths and flaws who played a crucial role in shaping our nation. We could admire his achievements, learn from his mistakes, and try to build a better future.
A future where everyone has liberty and justice.
Yes, exactly.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the life and legacy of James Madison. We've explored his triumphs, his contradictions, and hopefully come away with a better understanding of, not just this one man, but the complexities of history itself.
It's been a great discussion,
Mm-hmm.
and I hope it encourages everyone to keep learning, keep exploring.
Absolutely. The best way to honor the legacy of figures like Madison is to keep working towards that more perfect union.
That's
A
right.
union that truly embodies those ideals of liberty and justice for everyone.
Couldn't agree more.